After viewing the previous video, it should be evident that the embryology as found in the Quran not only lacks detail, but aspects of it are incorrect, and is actually a rehash of earlier views. It will be conclusively shown in this video that the Quran did not bring anything new to science, as it was simply a copy of previous theories. An example is when the Quran says alaqa, referring to the clinging, clotted blood which goes on to form flesh or lahm in Arabic. This is an idea that comes primarily from ancient Greek understanding of embryology. For example, Hippocrates, born in 460 BC, believed that the flesh is formed after the coagulation of the mother's blood. This is found on page 35 of the book authored by Cambridge professor Joseph Needham, A History of Embryology. For Quran 23:14, notice in this translation by a Muslim, he uses the same words to describe the formation of the embryo by saying coagulated blood which goes on to form the flesh, just as was stated hundreds of years earlier by Greek physicians. Another ancient Greek physician, Aristotle, in his book on the generation of animals, written sometime around 350 BC, gives the stages of embryological development within animals. He recounts this in section 654b, which is analogous to Quran 22:5 and 23:14, when it talks about stages such as the semen, nutfa, then the clotting of blood, alaqa, which goes on to form the flesh, lahm, with the bones, izam, formed at the end. For example, in section 728a of his work, he highlights these stages. As an illustration, in part 8 of this rendition, Aristotle, after speaking about how the semen and female fluids go on to form the embryo, he gives a stage-like explanation of the formation of the flesh and the body of the other organs, such as bones, and how flesh grows around them. Perhaps the most influential Greek upon the Quran was Galen. Just like the Quran, Hadith, and classical Quran commentators, some of which were evidenced in the previous videos. On page 50 on the semen, Galen is quoted as saying, "The substance from which the embryo is formed is from menstrual blood plus the two semens." This is referenced by University of Rome professor of Greek and literature Dr. Julia Ecker in her research on page 63, Galen on infertility. The link is below. The Quran agrees with Galen when it says in 76:2, "We created man from a drop of mingled sperm." Provided in the link below, Quran commentator Ibn Kathir confirms it means the fluid of the man and the fluid of the woman when they meet and mix. This is just as Galen had suggested. Although more references were provided in a previous video about Quran 76:2 commentaries, within Tafsir al-Baghawi he quotes Al-Hasan as saying the verse means a sperm drop mixed with blood, which is menstrual blood, and if she becomes pregnant, menstruation stops. Galen had already suggested the sperm mixing with menstrual blood produces a baby. Concerning embryological development, Galen also taught that the embryo developed in stages, although his explanations were far more in detail than the Quran. He writes about the semen prevailing. In Arabic, the Quran uses the word nutfa. Galen goes on to say, when it has been filled with blood, this will be the blood clot or alaqa as the Quran describes it. And heart, brain and liver are still unarticulated and unshaped, yet have by now a certain solidity and considerable size. This is the second period. The substance of the fetus has the form of flesh and no longer the form of semen. This is now the lahm of flesh stage as the Quran describes. The Quran in 22:5 not only reflects Galen's teachings, but similar terminology is used when it says about the embryo that it is both shaped and unshaped, and that there are stages in its development. In the Yusuf Ali translation it says, then out of a morsel of flesh, partly formed and partly unformed. Again, it sounds similar to Galen. Just as the Quran refers to stages of the embryo's development, with the flesh clothing the bones towards the end. On page 101 of his book, Galen went on to say, and now the third period of gestation has come, going on to say, thus it caused flesh to grow on and around all the bones. The Quran is in conformity with this, where in the final stage it says in 23:14, and we clothed those bones with flesh. Galen's work, The Semen, was considered so important that copies of his medical treatises were still being made in the 15th century. In fact, his work on embryology was so significant that manuscripts of Galen's work were translated into Arabic. For example, this one is from the 12th century, currently housed in the British Library. It was created by early Muslim Ibn Munir al-Kilani in 1184. The Greek influence upon the Arabs will be covered more in detail in a later video. Although modern Muslims deny any connection between Greek embryology and the Quran, early Muslim physicians such as Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyah, as found in his famous prophetic medicine, Tib an-Nabawi, was one of the first to acknowledge that the Quran indeed mirrored Galen. For example, Ahmed Ragab reviewed the book in Prophets of Medicine and Medicine of the Prophet in his paper submitted to Harvard University. On page 7, he mentions how Ibn al-Qayyim's medical practice as a Muslim was based on Galen. On pages 11 to 12, Ibn al-Qayyim, being a scientist and physician, found himself at odds with Muhammad's supernatural views on medicine when Muhammad described fever is from the hellfire. As a Muslim, Ibn al-Qayyim tried to justify Muhammad's claims by saying Muhammad must have meant it as a metaphor. But then Ibn al-Qayyim goes on to explain the medical causes of fever and their treatments in a naturalistic way. The eminent Harvard-educated Professor Dr. Basim Musallam, once director of the Center of Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies at the University of Cambridge, who is a life fellow at King's College, Cambridge. In 1983, he published a book called Sex and Society in Islam, pictured here. On page 54, he concluded, the stages of development which the Quran and the Hadith established for believers agreed perfectly with Galen's scientific account. He then goes on to say there is no doubt that medieval thought appreciated this agreement between the Quran and Galen, for Arabic science employed the same Quranic terms to describe the Galenic stages. In other words, when it comes to embryology, the Quran merely echoes the scientific knowledge men had already discovered hundreds of years earlier. Professor Keith Moore is a person whose book Muslims love to quote, who is claimed to have seen the light of Quranic embryology, although he strangely never became a Muslim. The reasons behind his motives was explained in a previous video. Nonetheless, in the 6th edition of The Developing Human, published in 1998, on page 15, he directs his readers to read an essay by Dr. Basim Musallam, the very same professor who was just quoted as saying Quranic embryology was the same as Greek Galenic embryology. It seems Dr. Moore is not impressed about Quranic embryology as Muslims of today are, who prefer to cite and quote his earlier Islamic rendition. Even in this edition, on page 8 of the book, Dr. Keith Moore mentions it was ancient Greeks such as Hippocrates, Aristotle and Galen who were the ones who laid down the foundations of embryology. Notice it's not the Arabs or the Quran that came much later and no doubt benefited from the insights of their predecessors. In the next few videos, detailed accounts will be shown of the Greek science's influence upon the Quranic text and its influence upon early Arabs. Professor Joseph Needham, praised by Cambridge University, where he graduated from and also taught, a person who is considered to be one of the most outstanding intellectuals of the 20th century by the university. The link to the article is below. After having spent almost 60 pages in his groundbreaking book, A History of Embryology, where he discusses ancient Greek, also going on to discuss Indian and Egyptian embryology, but in less than one page, on page 82, he dismisses the entire Arab tradition by concluding that Arabic science was not of great help to embryology. After listing some of the verses in the Quran about embryology, he dismisses them as a, quote, the 7th century echo of Aristotle and Ayurveda. In other words, a mixture of Greek and ancient Indian teachings. He also says that Avicenna's work on embryology, as found in Canon of Medicine, added nothing to Galen's work. So in conclusion, Quranic terms that describe the formation of the embryo in stages with words like semen to blood, from flesh to bones, are all found within ancient Greek understanding of embryology. The most influential Greek upon the Quran was probably Galen, whose work, The Semen, was so important the copies were being translated by Arabs. Some of the manuscripts can still be found in museums today. Early Muslim physicians such as Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyah and modern objective Muslim academics acknowledge that the Quranic material mirrors the works of ancient Greek physicians. World-renowned scholars from prestigious universities have written accounts on how the Quran did not bring anything new on the subject, as it was just based from previous works.